Greetings, Roastbrief community, and welcome to another episode of The Brief. This week, we're extremely lucky to have a very special guest described as a rare polymath with deep expertise in tech and psychology, a career that spans in human behavior, web experience, and the arts, offering us a rare vantage point on the biggest question facing us today. How do we stay human in a world being rewritten by AI? She's also a best-selling author behind two must-reads, Webs of Influence, The Psychology of Online Persuasion, and Business Unusual, which explores values, uncertainty, and the psychology of brand resilience. She's also rocked stages at South by Southwest, Web Summit, and spoken at institutions like Cambridge, UCL, while shaping executive strategies behind closed doors for Fortune 500 boardrooms. From the ethics of AI and automation to the psychology of Gen Z, to how brands can build real resilience without selling out their soul. Welcome, Nathalie Nahai.
Thank you for having me. What a treat.
As we approach what many would describe as a point of singularity, it's always a good idea to stop, take a deep breath, and look at where we're all heading. Mm-hmm. I'd like to explore some of these avenues with you because it's important for this audience. There's so many working creative agencies and large brands on how to take the right decisions when it comes to generative AI and their own creative workflows. But before we dive into the roots, let's do some quick fire questions.
Oh, I like these.
AI in 2030, friend or foe?
Depends where you're living.
Most overrated buzzword in tech right now?
Vibe.
One word to describe Web3.
Promising.
What's more dangerous, deepfakes or clickbait?
Deepfakes.
If agency creative had one ethical blind spot, what is it?
The living earth.
Thank you, Nathalie. Love those. Now that we've got our juices flowing, let's start diving into the weeds. So, What is the promise? What is the AI promise? Do you feel that it's going to supercharge our creativity? So if we could start exploring the possibility to automate inspiration. Is that an oxymoron?
So, and I didn't think I was going to go here, but it's what's come to mind as you've asked. So inspiration, it's about in-breath. It's about having some kind of receptivity to something that perhaps exists out there. It could be in the archetypal mind, or as Jung might say, the cosmic unconscious or the collective unconscious. It's in response to something which is living, breathing, and potential. And I think humans, with our consciousness and sensitivity, are able to get these strokes of insight, inspiration, if you like. And when we're thinking about that as an interrelating thing, so it's us in response to something else, to imagination, to dreaming, to things you might have read or seen. We're not at the stage yet, I would argue, that AI has any of those qualities for consciousness, for sentience. I know a lot of people would like to suggest otherwise. And so I think when it comes to creativity, deciding how we use AI to augment our capacities is actually the more interesting question, because it's not a point of, I don't think AI is yet at the point where it can generate for itself. It's not responding from a deeper sense of volition, interiority, inspiration. And so when we're thinking about using AI tools, it's like, well, what tasks can it help us benefit from in terms of unlocking? So it could be ideation is a great example. So if you say, okay, well, Claude or ChatGPT or whatever it is, Sora, I'd like you to give me 20 ideas for this specific prompt, and we can carefully, creatively craft an amazing prompt, get a bunch back, and then operate as the editor curator to then build on those things. But the idea itself, the creative kernel, if you like, comes from the person embedded within a culture, a body, and a timeline that is much richer than can be collapsed into any form of language, which is what LLMs use to generate answers.
There's one particular ad that has had quite a lot of criticism, and that is the Salesforce ad during the Super Bowl.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what's blatantly been communicated there wrongfully.
All right. So the ad And this is a classic example of people just not thinking. It's like this cognitive laziness, which is a human problem, not an AI problem, which is let's just outsource the whole thing and not sense check what we're getting as the output. So the ad that I'm thinking of that you're referring to was with Matthew McConaughey. And the idea is that you have this scene where he's been put in the rain on an outside table at a restaurant and served food he doesn't like. And the whole thing is, well, if I'd used an AI agent, I would have been able to get a table that I liked inside, not in the pouring rain, with food that I actually eat. When was the last time you went to a restaurant when it was pouring outside, got sat outside at a table you didn't want and ate food you didn't order? Like, it does not happen unless someone's playing a prank on you. So it's solving for a problem that doesn't exist, A. And B, it just makes the entire capability of AI agents, it undermines the whole argument. So it's stupid on various different levels, I think. And yet we know that AI can automate really useful things that are perhaps less sexy, but equally valuable. So things like if you're going away for a week and you're going to miss a bunch of meetings because you're taking some well-deserved time off, when you come back, if you've got an AI assistant that's able to summarize key themes of meetings that you needed to go to that you weren't able to, you can hit the ground running. Brilliant use case for AI, really valuable. Yeah. And you can fact check it because there are still hallucinations, or I prefer to call them fabrications. It's less loaded and doesn't infer sentience. But so let's look at the things that it can do and not make a worse not for people by pointing towards irrelevant problems that we just don't need to use AI for. That's where I land currently with the whole thing.
Yes, and I think the whole use of personal agents are still needs to be unpacked, and I think there's the big tech are fighting for you to have theirs, whether it's Apple or if it's Google or Microsoft. But what if we look at it from a perspective of a large conglomerate? Mm-hmm. So what I want to focus on just briefly now is what L'Oreal's doing. They are one of the largest beauty companies in the world, and they've always been investing in technology, not just for products, but also how they go to market. One of the things that I feel that it's probably quite ethical of them is that they are disclosing what they're doing.
Yeah,
they are doing it with Google and Meta, but they are doing it in a way that does bring some uncertainty and some insecurity to the advertising world, because one of the things that they're doing is that traditionally they've had to cut hundreds of pieces of content to fit into several markets. What they can do now with the help of Google is generating these videos and then having an infinite amount of this copy that will resonate in each of these territories, whereas before you'd have to engage with a local agency that produces local content with local talent. Whilst that is good for business, tell us a little bit about how you would reflect on such a motion like that by such a large player.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there. So I think if we're saying it's good for business, which business and for how long? If you're able to have, which we currently do, several really big players, and if they're able to deliver well on what they say they can, which is another big if, and we can come to that in a bit, then for the sake of short-term money saving, cultural personalization, or hyper individual personalization, for saving money and getting a good enough product out there in terms of the advert, if we're thinking of that as the product, you risk cannibalizing other businesses. That's often been the case in other times where we've had big changes like the Industrial Revolution. But the massive difference between then and now is that AI potentially is implicated across all strata of society, industry, and potentially the world, like global supply, everything. It touches everything. It's not just, I want to get an iPhone, so I'm going to go to the factory instead of going to a craftsperson who couldn't do it now anyway because things are too complex. So there's a question around which business benefits for how long and from what, and what are the externalities? So how do then there's economic knock-on effects. So if you destabilize entire countries because you're going for short-term wins, which leaves people out of a job, that's another big concern. Then there are issues around I mean, then, well, that's kind of the techno-feudalist issue, which Yanis Varoufakis talks a lot about, which is if you end up having monopolies, say, for instance, Meta, which I know we're going to probably touch on later, and they are then promising to be able to give you a full agency experience from ideation to, creating the creative output to delivery and then personalization. Well, if you've automated all of that, what's everyone else going to do? And the argument is, well, they'll find other jobs. It's like, well, not if you automate all the other jobs too.
Yeah.
Like, how many other jobs can you automate? Then there's issues around things like creativity and authenticity and what people value and for how long. So then there's generational differences. Maybe I'll just stop there because there are so many different things to unpack. It's an entire world that we're now looking into. In terms of
so if we race ahead, it does feel like there's going to be this resistancy, especially from agencies that have traditionally been, human heavy, at the forefront and the epicenter of creativity. So do you see a future where using human imagination is almost like a rubber stamp of originality?
So there's definitely a piece around originality and around earning trust. I remember reading an article a couple of months earlier that was talking that with the sheer amount of AI-generated content, much of which falls into the bucket of AI slop. Of course, one person's slop is another person's hilarious meme, but or like uncanny advert. When you have so much of that content being generated, the ability for brands to stand out, and of course, if you want to have an edge over the competition, you need to be distinctive. You need to have brand salience to be memorable, to evoke some kind of emotional response in the person that you're trying to target, your customer. That often is tied to unique brand voice. And if you've got a particular company doing all of the creative for loads of companies, and that LLM is embedded within a cultural context, we know from research that LLMs express, even unexplicitly or unintentionally, the ideologies of their makers, and homogenizes tone when it comes to the output, and also doesn't extract out bias, you're going to end up with a bunch of shit that looks the same, sounds the same potentially, and just completely flattens any distinctiveness that gives those brands that advantage. So it's not just about the rubber stamp of approval, which I agree is important. It's also how do you use, again, with discernment and critical thinking, how do you use AI to support you in taking care of the bureaucratic stuff that takes many, many hours, and there's a huge use case there, without stripping out the uniqueness, the brand voice. Or if you're at a point where, for instance, like Coca-Cola did when they worked with Colin Kaepernick for the, believe in something, even if it costs you everything campaign, when they polled it, they nearly didn't run with that ad. Why? Because it was going to alienate practically half of their customer base. And it did. If you asked AI to come up with that today, I don't imagine that it would go with something that would alienate 50% or thereabouts of its customer base. But because they're embedded in a cultural zeitgeist, they know that younger generations potentially are going to respond better to that orientation. And that's where the future money is. You can take that kind of high-level risk and take a short-term hit in order to orient your brand towards something that you think is coming, or to direct the cultural conversation. So there's all of these elements that creatives have to be in the room for, in the loop for. And that's not even touching on the ways in which our applications and ways of thinking are also influencing what we believe to be possible. So there's also something around that, like how do you create schemas or cognitive cages for the imagination that then make it harder for us to think outside the box? So if you limit the amount that people are exposed to, or you make it narrower in terms of diversity, then you also potentially strip people of the opportunity to come into contact with ideas, cultures, opinions, perspectives that are going to challenge them, that create that fantastic friction point, that spark that new idea. There's so much to consider.
Yeah, there's a lot actually. And you're right, I don't think AI's quite there yet to think for itself. And it comes down to this hedging creativity, which can only really be taken by risk takers, which are predominantly, they're still human, right? Yeah. We still go for that. But I think what you said about investing for the future, and if that costs you isolating 50% of your audience, actually that's forward thinking. That's quite prudent. Let's carry on with some of these pitfalls. So where do you think creativity right now is getting compromised?
Great question. So, I mean, the obvious, I think, for most folks who would have seen some of the Christmas ads, and again, anyway, there's so many. I wish I had like 5 days to go through this. But so the iconic Coca-Cola Christmas ad, holidays are coming.
Yes,
there's that.
the American truck, right?
Right, the American truck. And while I have real issues with the fact that, hyper capitalization, there's all sorts of problems that are coming off the back of that. There's no growth on a finite planet that's being extracted beyond its resources. So there's all sorts of other stuff that we can come to, which I think are actually really important. But for the purposes of this conversation, right. So Coca-Cola, based in America, in a Western context, makes these ads connecting Santa with the red of Coca-Cola. Originally, he used to be green. There's some stories about how it converted to red. So the brands have huge impact potentially when they're that big.
Yeah.
And one of the things, for good or for bad, and I actually do like the ads, so there we go, that Coca-Cola does, is to create these ads. And they are moments of delight, even if you don't drink Coca-Cola. And this year, they do, I think, the lazy thing. They go, we're going to go for the trend. We're going to create something using AI. And clearly, they either didn't test it on real people, or they tested it and thought, well, sod it, we're going to go anyway. Whatever they did, and I don't know exactly what went on behind closed doors, it didn't land with people. The magic evaporated, and there was a void, and it undid years of earned anticipation, magic, trust, all this kind of stuff. And of course, they can get it back. Next year, they might, if they're clever. If I was on the creative board, I'd be like, right, guys, we messed up. Next year, let's do something that is so focused on humans. Maybe we bring in a joke. We make something that kind of is self-referential, and we use it as a jumping off point to say, okay, you can use AI, but maybe you go a more human-centered route. That would be brilliant. Please steal that idea and run with it. There is an opportunity to do that. And yet so many brands are going, well, let's just try this thing, having not first asked the question, what are we trying to achieve? What emotion are we expecting that we're wanting to elicit? Is this the best tool for the job? Let's test it and see where we land. So I think there are huge problems with using AI at the wrong stage of the creative process and just offloading our mental capacities and going, okay, well, I'm not going to use my discernment, my critical thinking, and my ability to split test something. Like all of that hard-earned knowledge just goes out the window, and then what? So it's just laziness.
It's quite shocking that an iconic brand would take such risks, but like you say, hopefully they've learned from it.
They can do so much better. Come on.
They will. I have hope in them.
And they weren't, I'm picking on them. They weren't the only ones, but it's because their ads are so historically good that's where you see the biggest disparity.
Yeah, so let's expand on that a little bit. So what do you think the risks are of this, homogeneity, which could be classed as shallow content, creative span, for people on the receiving end?
So when people talk about economics of attention and how we're so bombarded, there's so many issues. I think we're kind of crescendoing to this peak attention fragmentation place. If you think about the number of hours that people spend on social media predominantly and how so many ads are in that space that then take a lot of the attention that we might otherwise spend on other things. Just like back in the day when banners were a thing on websites and there became this thing called banner blindness, people would just ignore those places in the F shape that they would normally get some of these things. I think there is also a case to be made for potential adaptation to ads. You just see them everywhere. So, and then also a sort of a flip side to that, when the social and cultural and personal cost of constant exposure to social platforms gets too high, as we're starting to see in certain countries where they're now banning social media and perhaps even smartphones for people under the age of, for example, 16, 15, whatever. Then it brings into question other really significant issues, which is, okay, not only are we, I suppose, kind of turning on this fire hose of content and information to people who are fragmented in their attention and frazzled and digitally overwhelmed, but then what's that going to mean where there are so many brands competing for the same finite attention? Do people just start to switch off? And then what are the alternatives? So if people are coming off platforms like X and Instagram and they're moving towards closed community platforms or federated platforms or chat groups where advertising hasn't been able yet to encroach, where then will you advertise? So then it's kind of, in some ways, it might be full loop back to experiential kind of things like Red Bull would have done,
Of course.
or in the actual service. So I'm hopeful that at some point, I mean, obviously you still have things like, well, even Netflix, people will pay for these channels. So at this point of turbulence where I think social media use is going to have to come down, it's going to regulate in some way. People are going to want to take their time back. People are still going to the movies, they're still reading books, they're using platforms that they're paying for, but then that means the advertisers don't get in. So like, where does advertising fit? Can it do better in an oversaturated marketplace where people are just so fragmented? What do you think about all of this? Because there's so much noise and turbulence.
I see that AI is already making its way into these private environments that people have cultivated with their closest friends and family. I mean, on WhatsApp, you can't stop seeing the AI chat opportunity at the top of your most guarded conversations. Yeah. So you're right. I think that the medium is slightly different, but the doors are open.
Yeah.
And I think it's about how do you ingest these private bots to help you with your daily tasks. So it's something to be wary of. I am with you. I feel that in terms of governance, smartphones to be banned under the age of 14, 15. I think that's wise. Why not? Bring back Snake, bring back some of these brick phones. Maybe we'll see more Nokias like we used to. But that's not a bad thing at all, especially because it's very difficult to safeguard kids as well from the platforms and what they're showing this content. So that's thank you for that, Nathalie. Now, something was said by Mark Zuckerberg only last Friday. He was speaking to Ben Thompson from The Strategy, and he basically talks about eliminating the whole advertising ecosystem. We touched upon it earlier on, but what Meta essentially want to do is they want to take care of everybody's creatives. And because they have such a powerful algorithm, not only will they take over the creatives, but they know exactly where to target them with your message. Just having the business objective in mind is simply all that you will need when you get into their ecosystem.
According to them.
According to them, yeah. So the question is, for our audience, as someone that's in the creative industry, they might see this as definitely as a risk of losing their development path, right, to automation. How can they safeguard their trajectory in their careers right now?
People in the creative agencies.
Yeah.
The first place my head goes to is who owns the data around all of those relationships between. So say, for instance, Meta, you outsource everything to Meta. You go, right, we're going to lay off all these people. We're going to save this much money in this much time. Let's use Meta. A couple of considerations. If they're serving you with a creative and they say, well, this works, how do you know it works? Like, we know from ads that have been served previously that if you don't have any transparency about numbers, how are you as the paying agency going to know if what the impact they're reporting is actually the impact that's being felt or being had? So huge issues around transparency, huge issues around who owns the customer brand relationship. What if they create creativity, like create a creative that you don't agree with? How often can you go back and say, well, actually, we don't want this, we want that? Like, there's a whole, if you go to an agency and you say, well, this ad doesn't quite hit the money, we want you to do X, Y, or Z. What happens if that goes against, let's say, for instance, just to stir the pot here a bit, let's say you are a STEM organization in the States, and the current administration says you can't do any outreach to anyone in a specific target group. Let's say it's women in STEM. And you reach out to Meta, they're based in the States, and you say, we want to create some kind of advert for young girls in schools to help them get into STEM. Which, if you think about the whole innovation ecosystem, we need as many bright minds from whatever cultural embodied context they're in, whoever you are in the world. We want, at least that's the world I want to live in, that doesn't matter where you're born or how you present, whatever, you get the chance to shine. And so if you collapse that opportunity, then Meta can turn around and say, well, no. So they become the gatekeepers of moral decisions, ethical decisions, creative decisions, business decisions. And we know that people in different businesses have different values. Think about Patagonia versus, not versus, but Anthropic. They have constitutional AI. They're a very different beast to open AI. And yet they operate in the broad AI tech space. So like, if you suddenly hand over everything to a company that already has way too much, you are absolutely digging your own grave. Yeah, 100%. And this is before you get to neurotech. We haven't even touched on that. If you're starting to imagine you have all of this data, which becomes your data as Meta, all of these agencies just give you their keys, all of the creative, all of the information from their customers. And then Meta comes out and says, right, we're going to use this, or OpenAI, whatever. We've designed this neurotechnology. If you give people, let's say, a particular type of wearable that can track heart rate variability, biometrics, EEG, whatever else you want to do, and we can tell when they are most suggestible before they fall asleep. That's you can pay a premium for that real estate of cognitive. There are so many issues. Yeah. Do not hand over the car keys. Don't do it. It's an absolutely insane idea. And of course, some people, because they're pressured for money and time, won't have many other options. But for the brands that have deeper pockets, make the same decision. Don't cannibalize everything you've worked so hard to build by handing all of that over to one of these monoliths. It's a terrible idea.
That's sound advice. So it also feels from their point of view to be practical and actually use some of the other platforms which provide equally, interesting places to communicate brand strategy, more ethical perhaps, and not as intrusive. So that's
I think the thing is variety, having ecosystems. There are extraordinary platforms. Like I use Canva. I've historically used Asana and Notion. You can use, if you want to use Midget, there's so many tools that you can use that do an amazing job, that have access to brilliant minds that can automate a lot of this stuff. So you can save money and get better output and reduce, the amount of time before you get to the place that you want to. But just keep a rich ecosystem approach. Don't hand everything over to a single individual. It never works in the long run, apart from for that person or entity that accrues all the power.
Mark and his crew.
Exactly. Yeah. Or any other crew for that matter. But yes,
So Nathalie, we know that you have your own podcast and I've listened to several episodes. It's called In Conversation, but there was one in particular with Dr. Margaret Hefferman
brilliant
a couple of months ago. Yeah. Loved it. She was extremely insightful.
Yes.
And one of the things that I love what she said was her analogy. And it goes a little bit something like this. And she put it in such a way, relating it to cooking, because we're all very capable of preparing good food, right? The problem is that, we've been taught, or we've been kind
of encouraged, I guess.
We've been encouraged to, consuming more and more of this processed food, and sadly, the world is now hugely persuaded to go that way just for convenience. So one of her analogies is that how we're doing with thinking? Are we disenfranchising ourselves and going through this process thinking? And what are the dangers? There's obviously some huge pitfalls in doing that as a go-to first for any idea.
So there are some interesting studies that are coming out looking at the ways in which we use AI can either have, there can be a variety of consequences to the ways in which we use AI. So if you're, so hard, because there's so many examples to give. So if you're thinking about the ability of people coming into your organization at a junior level to perform, a couple of years ago, there's a great example here where the FT had done an interview with people working in law. And prior to that, someone had said, well, there's always kind of, reports in 2024, half of the workforce or 80% of the workforce is going to have to reskill in AI. AI will be able to export all this work to agents, And then in the FT, in this conversation with someone within the law industry, they said, well, if we do that, if we adopt that, as in get everyone at the entry level to use AI to offload some of the grunt work, if we do that, we're cannibalizing the entire industry, because it's through that high friction, high grit, uncomfortable, unhappy making grunt work that people learn how to deal with larger caseloads. Not that there aren't problems within it, of course there are, but higher caseloads, figuring out how to judge the quality of a report or where there might be certain patterns. Like, you're removing their training ground for sharpening their intellect and being able to perform at a high level, and these are the people who are going to be the lawyers and the attorneys and the attorney generals of tomorrow, next year, whatever. So the question there always is, again, in the wider context of a human life and a human civilization, what are the skills that we need to be able to support in order that we can make better, higher functioning decisions in the future? And so then some universities have taken what I think is a really interesting approach to education, where they know that students are going to be using AI to write coursework or essays. And so rather than banning it, they're saying, okay, here is the challenge for the essay. This is what we want you to write about. Go home, use whatever AI platform you want. You can use multiple or whatever. Come back in the next day. And the next day, we are going to critique the output of the AI who has written or that has written this particular essay. And that way, they get used to using the AI tools. They get used to looking at what the flaws might be. If there is a homogeneity in terms of tone of voice when they compare between different people, depending on the platform they've used, are there different types of motifs you might notice in the text that's written? So there you have a much more kind of critical approach using those tools, not banning them, but then going, okay, well, actually, is this helping me solve the problem while also dealing with the subject matter? And I think that kind of smarter thinking is exactly what we need, so that we're not kind of just cutting it off, but we're being critical in how we use it, and that the output and the discernment and the critical thinking and the knowledge is augmented.
Yeah.
So there are ways. You just got to be creative with it.
There are ways, and I think we're seeing some of the impacts now. When you spoke to Margaret, she was very clear about her conversations with some of the creative powerhouses. It's like they bring in the smartest from MIT, from Cambridge, wherever, and they're excellent at, churning out all of this productivity. However, she was very clear about it, is when they were asked to take a strategy to the next level, they got this creator's block. And I feel this is already kind of happening in these powerhouses. And it's almost like, how do you liberate them in such a way so that they can go through some of the hardship, which does shape your intellect, your imagination, because as she quite rightly put it in there, they're starting to see some of these creative blockages within the creative agency.
Well, I think, creativity is often in response to containment or a specific, if you give people challenges or certain remits within which to create, you have to get pluralistic in your approach, which is why diverse teams almost always outperform non-diverse teams. It's because if you're thinking in alternative ways, because you've got a block, you're going to come out with something that ends up being better. So I think if we're thinking about that and the idea that diversity typically, when well managed, leads to a plurality of results that are more creative, more ingenious, more innovative, then thinking about how AI can help with that, it could be that it helps upstream at the hiring level. So to say, okay, well, rather than just do quotas, which have limited help, you can say, okay, well, what if we were to create pipelines, for use of a better word, where people in underserved areas, in underserved schools, have access to programs that allow them to develop these things, these ways of thinking, access to tools, being able to use AI, whatever it is, to be able to get to the point where they can enter into industry, and you have a huge wealth of talent that isn't struck out from first principles, from bias in where you grew up or access to. So there again, AI has a potential, if used with integrity and explicit values-driven kind of, if you're baking those values into the beginning, you could transform society, but you have to look at the incentives and then how to bake it out from there. So my problem with my biggest concern, it's not so much problem with the companies that are making these decisions now, is that so much is not transparent, so much is aligned with making the biggest buck in the short amount of time. And we know that people always suffer when that happens. And so, but that's not the only future we face. We can have so many brighter futures. We just have to think, what systemic change do we need? How do we reduce bias, get access to people who otherwise wouldn't have it? Like, everyone could benefit from this if we use it smarter. That's it.
I love that framework. It sounds like the ultimate recipe to protect the soul of creativity. So Nathalie, let's dive into the ethics. And I'm thinking here about a framework that some of these managers can adopt. One of the things that we are seeing is that the creator economy again is under the spotlight because of how resilient it is against AI, against Gen AI, video production. Do you feel that is going to be part of the framework to keep this human intellect at the epicenter of a brand's communication? And I think one of the companies being very brave at being open about it is Unilever itself, with a new CEO saying that it will invest 20x into its creators and how it delivers its message to the world. What are your thoughts on the overall framework of the ethics?
So starting there, because that's very, very interesting, that in a context where AI slop seems to be everywhere, to then say, well, we're going to take a stand, that's a moral stand, I think. It's really hard to not see it in that way. You could compare it, for instance, to farmers deciding in the States that they want to be USDA organic or fair trade, for instance. That you can say, okay, even though the broader trend is towards pesticides on everything or exploitative business practices, we're going to go organic or fair trade or regenerative, whatever it is. And to say, well, okay, we're going to go human first, and to lead that charge, it's also saying a lot about the values of the company and what they believe in and the kind of world they might want to live in. So I think that already makes a point of difference. And then what happens from that perspective if you have entire generations coming up, and you see this with people who have kids or who have nephews and nieces, it's this fear around, well, what kind of world am I going to inherit? What career opportunities might I have? Is there going to be an intact ecosystem, food system, security? Like there are really big existential questions that everyone is exposed to, even in the protected West, where we're a bit more insulated from a lot of the consequences of our actions.
Yeah.
And so within that, you've got to think, okay, if a company takes a stand like that, are they going to be attracting the brightest minds who think, I want a different future? Yes. And it's not just going to be about how much money you earn, because if you're in a context where you're looking for greater meaning, a sense of somewhere where you can express your creativity, and it's not just about the paycheck, because that can't get you the house because you're priced out anyway, you are going to go for those companies, agencies, organizations that are more aligned with the values that you cherish. So I think from a perspective of talent acquisition, it makes a big difference. From a perspective of consumers, also, I don't like being advertised shit I don't need, but I do care if a company is thoughtful in their advertising, because we do need to advertise ourselves. Whatever we do, it's like, I know about you, you do lots of posting on LinkedIn and it's high value stuff, but I get the chance to know who you are. So it's not that we need to ban advertising and marketing and go way in the opposite direction, but it needs to be thoughtful. It needs to be aligned with the values that we care about as potential talent or potential customers or business partners. And as things get more complicated, which they inevitably will, for various reasons, is those companies that can take a stand, like Unilever or Patagonia or Bloom and Wild with their thoughtful marketing movement, that are going to captivate the hearts and minds that are aligned with that particular vision for the future.
Thank you, Nathalie. So let's look at humanity and the future for us, especially the ones working within creativity. You talked about us having this noose, tightening our awarenessness. Can we explore that again and just really understand what that really means and how this unlock so much opportunity for the audiences?
So this is one of the podcast episodes, wasn't it, about the noose around the awareness? So
yeah.
And is there a specific audience you want me to direct this out, or is it more like our creative potential?
I think, most of all, people that work in marketing technology, because that's what's at stake at the moment, is the big tech want to take that piece away, where there is such a huge livelihood for, thousands and thousands of people. So we want to retain that whilst adopting, AI in an ethical way. But if you could talk to us a little bit about how we can make sure that we do remain with the utmost awareness and not have this completely tighten our vision.
Yes. So one of the things that I think is really important, and I alluded to this at the top of our conversation, but I think it's worth diving into here, is that we exist in very complex contexts as humans. And I've thought about it in sort of three broad categories, although there are more. So cultural context, which we touched on, somatic or embodied context, and temporal context. So obviously with the zeitgeist, there are brands that will set the tone for the zeitgeist, others that play very specifically within a certain field, that occupy certain political or moral niches. But there's that layer to the equation when it comes to creativity and responding to what's expected at a cultural level. Then there's the somatic context. And often when we're thinking about what people will respond to in any form of emotive communication, we have to be able to discern between, and you'll see this if you've got kids, what they say and what their body is revealing. So all of the stuff that is not codified through language, that is gestural, that is perhaps witnessable in groups, you have to be able to look at ways in which people express emotion that's not quantifiable through language. And that's an element where often you might find trends first, where you might not read about it. Maybe it's behind closed doors or offline.
Yes.
And so there's that whole somatic element. And then testing things and watching is why people have focus groups. Watch this ad. How do you feel? And why people use tech to actually track that somatic response.
Yes.
EEG,
So much
heart rate
of it
variance.
now.
And we know this with biometrics. It's very, very well known. But then the third piece, beyond the cultural, the somatic, the embodied, is then the temporal. So this temporal piece, we all use, humans and machines, historic data to be able to make decisions. So if you're thinking about statistical models like LLMs that look at what's come before and use that which is most probable to create outputs which are perhaps predictable, that are more likely to elicit X, Y, and Z outcome, it kind of collapses possibilities into something which is more probable, more predetermined. Now, humans, we like that to a certain extent. We have heuristics in the mind or cognitive shortcuts based on our historical experience with the world that say, okay, well, I kind of know my way to work now, so I'll just take my main brain offline, or my neocortex, my thinking self, my conscious self, and my feet will carry me there, or whatever it might be. So we use historical information to make decisions and to make our lives easier. However, we also live dreaming into or worrying into the future. And it's not just about what's probable, what's come before. It's about pattern disruption. It's about dreaming, conjuring, creating at the emergent edges of possibility, like what could happen next. It's not just this utopian future, this dystopian future. It's kind of, there is something so fecund and vital about the human imagination. Everything that exists in this room, the mics that we're recording on, everything that you're wearing, had to first be conjured in the mind of someone or someone's in order to be made manifest into something that is something we can buy or use or eat outside of the natural world. So the human imagination is absolutely vital, and it operates in a way that machines cannot yet. And so thinking about those elements of our responsiveness to the culture, our understanding of how human bodies respond, even when language cannot be codified as sort of an expression of one's interiority. And then the temporal thing of dreaming into the future and making things happen that have not happened before, all of that needs to be taken into account. And people who are attuned creatively will naturally, I think, be looking out for these sorts of patterns, even if they haven't made it explicit. So this is a rallying cry for creatives. Let's tune ourselves to all of these skills which are hard to pinpoint, but are so vital in creating a campaign or an emotive message that sparkles with life and with possibility. And the most powerful of all of that is if you can do that in a way that creates a future in which everything can flourish. And I know this sounds a bit utopian, but with the place that we find ourselves now, geopolitical instability, supply chains being disrupted, climate weather events making it harder to predict how we have to get creative, and we have to safeguard everything that allows us to survive and to thrive. And that's our living systems. So if we can use our creativity in alignment with values that support the flourishing of life, regenerative systems, localization, to create businesses that can exist and thrive well into future generations. That for me is not just a huge business case, but that's also our responsibilities as a creator species. So let's just go for it.
That's powerful, Natalie. Wow. That's really powerful, which actually makes my next question pretty null and void, which was, can AI deepen human connection, or is it wishful thinking? I think
it can. Like, we just need to be more imaginative. Don't let these massive companies use it from the pure perspective of let's just extract everything. Like, no, fuck off. We can do so much better than this.
Yes.
AI could be extraordinary. Let's not limit it to the imaginations of a few people who just want to exploit everything else. Like, really? No. We're so much better than that.
We're better than that. Natalie, let's...
Sorry, that was quite a few F-bombings there. Sorry for anyone who might be...
No, it's fine. Get your water
unused to the salt.
for your final thought here. How do we position this final thought? How do we draw a line on something that you can't really draw a line on it?
I think so. It's not just people in the creative industries that are at risk here. Like, it's like, they came for these folks, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't under that category. And you can trace this back. I think we're existing in a moment of huge potential, beauty, creativity, imagination. We have these extraordinary tools. Yes, they have problems. Yes, they carry risks. But the only way that we're going to face into these risks and resolve them well is if we root ourselves in values in which the flourishing of all of life is paramount. And that's kind of where we make our decisions from. And so we do have to choose differently. Sometimes you have to make decisions that implicate short-term loss and put humans first, like perhaps Unilever does, or decide to retain these creatives rather than outsource everything because we've got a bit of wiggle room and we can stand up for something. Like, we are being invited, whether we believe it or not, to stand up for the kind of lives we want our children to be able to enjoy and inherit. And that includes in the creative industry. So, yes, of course, we have to function as businesses, meet the bottom lines, put roofs over our heads. But we also have to envision the kind of world in which we get our needs for beauty, meaning, connection met. That's the most important thing. I don't know, how many years do we get to live? 70, 80, 90 if we're privileged and protected?
Well, they're betting on us going to 110 with what's coming within stem cell treatments and some of the prescriptive.
But if all of that falls into a culture where there is such disparity and so much instability in the sort of civic structure, those benefits won't be realized. So, like, we get the chance to make smarter decisions, reclaim agency, use our creativity, be human-centric, but more than that, be eco-centric and think about how the ways that we can sort of safeguard a future that everyone can live well within and live creative and dignified lives. It sounds really utopian, but it doesn't have to be. There's so many things: local futures, regenerative agriculture, the Earth Species Project, using AI to decipher and communicate between different species. Like, there's so many ways in which we can.
It seems that it's going to be more useful for that industry, right? And I think that's where the focus probably needs to be on, not taking away people's livelihood.
And we need to legislate, because if you've got companies saying, "Oh, we're going to do all of this out of the goodness of our own heart," has that ever worked out? Maybe there's a handful of examples where the answer is yes.
Let's hope that governments are brave enough, because they haven't been brave enough in the past to govern digital, but maybe this is their opportunity.
And businesses can sometimes step up and show the way.
Yes.
I've not lost hope for that. Like, businesses are reflexive, they can respond quickly. And there will be some stars that come out of that and that will lead the way.
Well, I hope there's some stars listening to our show today. It's been an amazing session. Thank you so much, Nathalie. Now, there'll be lots of people that want to keep on listening to, your guidance through this tectonic shift. What's the best way to keep in touch with you, with all your work? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I have been running for the last 8 years now In Conversation with Nathalie Nahai, which is when I bring in different guests. We look at our relationship with technology and with AI, with the living world and with one another. You can also explore on the other side of what I do, which is kind of in the more creative world, the realist painting, the gatherings, the salons. You can look at natalienahai.art and ffsalons.com if you want to come and have rich conversations about how we flourish in times of turbulence. And then I do a lot of keynoting. So get in touch if you want to hear more or you want to collaborate on any exciting human-centered tech creative projects.
Oh, that's awesome, Natty. Thank you so much. And we can't wait to have you back on the next one. And I'm sure there's probably a follow-up session that we can do. I want to hear a response from some of these
Yes,
big
please.
agencies. So maybe we'll have you back for that one. Might be in Spanish, but I'm sure you can handle it.
Ya veremos.
Superb. So, Natalie, as part of our wrap up, we've been talking about all the impact that it has in humanity. What about the ecological impacts? What's it doing now? And, how are silly questions into, ChatGPT burning unnecessary resources? Tell us a little bit about that.
So this is one of the big, largely ignored externalities, and it's not an externality, but the idea that it's kind of an unfortunate consequence of the ways in which we're intensively using electricity and water and other resources to predominantly in the training stage of AI models. But we're using all of this energy up just at the time when we need to be reducing carbon footprints and reducing the amount of strain we're placing on the only system that we inhabit, which is Earth, so that we don't crash through all of the planetary boundaries, many of which we've already crashed through. So to avoid tipping points that are then irreparable. And so one of the things that I think is really tricky about human behavior, and having studied like human behavior and behavioral science for a long, long time, is that we tend to, myself included, all of us, as values driven as we are, we tend to err towards things that give us greater convenience, that reduce our mental or emotional or physical effort, because it's evolutionarily adaptive in a sense of if I can reduce the cost of living, my physical cost of being alive, then that's a win, right? In the short term, and it is in the short term. But when we're thinking about things like using AI for search, as you mentioned, or answering silly questions that I could otherwise just, do a bit of research in 10 minutes in, it's like, what's the benefit versus the cost? And because the cost or costs are so often intangible and they feel like they're external because they're out there, they're away, there is no such thing as away. We all have to drink the water to stay alive, eat the food to stay alive, breathe the air. Like all of this stuff, it's not intangible and abstract. It's really the basis of human and ecological life. And so I think my concern is if we don't find a way to legislate, perhaps through, you mentioned taxation off air earlier, or through having, maybe there's a quota. So you people might have a carbon budget, maybe you have an AI budget or whatever it is, then perhaps in the long term, actually,
you'll think twice about asking silly questions.
Yeah, and you might, instead of going to an AI platform and outsourcing the entire creative process because it's quick and so-called cheap, it might be cheaper in terms of ecological cost and quotas and tariffs, whatever, to use human teams. So it's like, okay, well, let's be discerning and selective about how we use these things. And that needs to happen really fast because so much of what we're needing to do is embroiled in or caught up in reducing the demands that we're placing on our finite resources.
And I feel there's a trap into how we're going to be adopting AI so quickly, because if there's this tectonic shift in, normally you would Google something, now you're ChatGPT, which means that everything that you used to ask one platform, we have a vast amount of options to choose from, is now being funneled into one answer. And who's in charge of that, right?
Who's in charge? And then how do you figure out the provenance of that answer? Yes, people are saying, well, you can see how it's just such an obvious example. Like, you can see the thinking, quote unquote, of the model of, I've been asked this question, this is the thing that I think it means, therefore I'm going to do this, that, and that, whatever research. How easy would it be for a chatbot or any kind of generative AI platform to fabricate all of that? Like, we know that hallucination happens at an astonishingly high rate, and more so in the more recent iterations or more developed versions of these Gen AI platforms than previous ones. And so it's not a leap of imagination to think that it would be very easy somehow for that to be fabricated too. I'm not an AI expert, but when you ask people who are, they also talk about this black box within which there isn't any human oversight. There's an opaqueness to the ways in which many of these models arrive at their output. So
and some have walked away from Google knowing where the future lies, right? They've walked in because they don't want any part of it.
Well, it is a moral question. And And we do get to collectively craft the kind of future we want to create. And I think the question is, how do so that legal structures have to be put in place, but also for those people who are saying, we're really close to this, we know some of what's going on, we can't know some of what's going on, and that's a cause for concern, let's slow down. We need to get beyond this race to the bottom, oh my God, those people are doing it, therefore we should too, and actually build structures that are really useful, viable alternatives by the people who know how to do that, with citizen engagement, to figure out what are the other models that we could create that provide a better pathway forward. Because if we all slip into fear, competition, and kind of this race to the bottom, it's going to cause some really big problems.
Yeah, let's not be lazy about it. Thank you very much, Nathalie. So let's not stop the conversation there. It's a conversation that needs to be active. So we really invite you to share with us your own agency ethics. So do tag us. All of our socials are here below for you to join the conversation. And if you want to use a hashtag, let's keep resilient. Okay, hashtag keep resilient, and do find Roastbrief on all our socials. So let's continue the conversation there.